Chapter 1. A Collision of Worlds. Cipher always hated the rich. The polished suits, the arrogance in their eyes, the entitlement dripping from their every word. It was like a constant reminder of everything he could never have. Working at the upscale Mayfair restaurant, he had seen more than enough of the rich and the powerful, and they all blended together into a single, revolting image. But none of them irritated him quite as much as Wesley. Wesley walked in every evening, like clockwork, impeccably dressed in a designer suit that only someone with too much money could afford. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floors as he surveyed the room with a gaze that made everyone else feel beneath him. Cipher could see it all in an instant. Rich, entitled, probably had no idea what it was like to struggle, to pay bills with the same money he sent home to his sick mother every month. But something else lingered beneath Cipher's resentment, the way his heart inexplicably quickened whenever Wesley came into view. Cipher had always thought of himself as someone who could keep his distance, who could judge the rich without getting emotionally involved. Yet here he was, fighting an almost magnetic pull toward someone he despised. Wesley caught Cipher's eye as he walked past, offering a smile that could melt anyone's resolve. "You're not quite the friendly type, are you?" Wesley's voice was smooth, almost teasing, as if he knew exactly what was going on in Cipher's head. Cipher shot him a look, trying to mask the unease that was creeping in. "I'm just doing my job," he replied curtly, setting a glass of wine down in front of the man, careful not to touch him too much. "I bet you are. But you're a lot more interesting than just a server," Wesley murmured, lingering just a little too close as their hands brushed. Cipher's stomach did a flip, but he refused to acknowledge it. Chapter 2. Unexpected Encounters. The days that followed felt like a strange dance, one where Cipher kept stepping on his own feet, trying to avoid Wesley's gaze. But Wesley made it clear he wasn't going to let Cipher hide behind his judgments. He kept coming back to the restaurant, engaging in the same subtle flirtations that set Cipher's pulse racing. "Did you know," Wesley said one evening, his voice low and casual as he leaned against the bar, "that the most successful people have to keep some distance from the ones they want to impress? Maybe I should stop talking to you if I want a better tip." Cipher rolled his eyes, trying to ignore the way Wesley's proximity made his body feel warm. "I'm not here to impress anyone. Just here for the paycheck," he replied, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Wesley grinned, a knowing smile that made Cipher's heart race. "Funny, because you're doing a terrible job at pretending you're not interested in more than just a paycheck." Cipher clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to give in. Not to him. Not to someone who probably had the power to crush him without even blinking. But then Wesley reached out, his fingers brushing Cipher's hand as he passed him the bill. It was brief, but the contact lingered in the air like a spark, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Cipher's breath caught, and he couldn't quite remember how to breathe. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. Every shift was becoming harder to endure. Wesley was a constant presence now, and Cipher was beginning to feel the pressure. The line between his anger and attraction was blurring, and it frustrated him to no end. He hated how Wesley could make him feel like this, a mixture of irritation and longing. One evening, after a particularly tense encounter where Wesley had dropped an offhand comment about how money was the key to success, Cipher had had enough. "Not everyone has the luxury of sitting around and pretending they have all the answers," Wesley, Cipher said, his voice shaking with frustration as he leaned across the counter. "Some of us have to work for everything we get." Wesley didn't back down. Instead, he stepped closer, the air between them crackling. "Maybe you're working for the wrong things then," he said softly, his voice low and dangerous. "What would happen if you stopped resenting everyone who had more than you? What if you let someone like me show you what's possible?" Cipher's heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at Wesley, meeting his gaze for the first time without the barrier of judgment. For a split second, it was as though the world around them disappeared, and it was just the two of them, locked in an unspoken tension that neither of them knew how to release. "I don't need anything from you," Cipher said, but even to his own ears, it sounded like a lie. Wesley took a step closer, and Cipher could feel his breath on his skin. "I think you need more than you realize," Wesley whispered before his lips brushed against Cipher's ear, sending a shiver down his spine. Chapter 4. Unraveling Layers. It wasn't until their next encounter that the distance between them started to disappear completely. Cipher had been avoiding Wesley as best as he could, But when he saw the man standing at the bar again, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, all of his earlier resolve seemed to melt away. "You can stop pretending," Wesley said as Cipher walked by. His voice was calm, yet there was a glint in his eye that told Cipher he knew everything. "Pretending," Cipher muttered, barely able to meet his gaze. His heart was pounding in his chest, his body betraying him. "Yeah. Pretending you don't want to get closer," Wesley replied with a smirk. "You've been running away from it long enough." Before Cipher could protest, Wesley reached out, gently placing a hand on his wrist. The touch was brief, but it sent a shockwave through Cipher's body. His breath hitched, and he tried to pull away, but Wesley didn't let go. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" Wesley's voice was softer now, almost pleading. "What are you so afraid of?" Cipher's heart raced in his chest, his thoughts swirling. "I'm afraid that I'll like it," he confessed, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Wesley's expression softened, and for the first time, Cipher saw the vulnerability that had been hidden behind the confident facade. "What if that's exactly what you need?" Wesley murmured, pulling Cipher closer until they were nearly face to face. Chapter 5. Crossing Boundaries. The tension between them had reached a breaking point. That night, after closing time, Wesley asked Cipher to walk with him. It wasn't the first time they'd been alone together, but something felt different this time, like the weight of everything they'd both been holding back was finally about to explode. As they strolled through the quiet streets, Wesley reached for Cipher's hand. It was a simple gesture, yet it sent an electric jolt through Cipher's body. "Tell me you don't feel it," Wesley whispered, his face inches from Cipher's. "Tell me you don't feel the pull between us." "I don't," Cipher started to say, but before he could finish, Wesley's lips crashed onto his, silencing him completely. The kiss was intense, hungry, and filled with everything they hadn't been able to say. Cipher's hands found their way to Wesley's shoulders, pulling him closer as he melted into the kiss, every ounce of his resistance breaking down. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathing heavily, their faces flushed. "I think I like you," Cipher said, his voice barely a whisper, but the vulnerability in his eyes told Wesley everything he needed to know. "I know," Wesley replied, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think you've liked me for a long time now." And for the first time in weeks, Cipher didn't feel the need to argue. He just let himself feel the connection, the spark that had been there all along. Chapter 6. The Walls Crumble. The tension between Cipher and Wesley wasn't just physical anymore. It had become something more, a quiet storm simmering beneath the surface. Cipher couldn't deny that Wesley had broken through the walls he had spent years building. Each encounter felt like a test, pushing Cipher closer to the edge of a precipice he had never expected to fall from. It had been a few days since the kiss, since their world had shifted from casual animosity to something more complicated, more intense. Cipher spent his shifts avoiding Wesley's gaze, but there was no denying that the attraction was there. It simmered in the air, between them, undeniable. One night, just after closing, Wesley made his way to the kitchen where Cipher was finishing up. The usual bustle of the restaurant was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the soft clink of glass. Cipher didn't turn around at first, but he could feel Wesley's presence. Strong, commanding, impossible to ignore. "You've been avoiding me," Wesley's voice was low, rich with a hint of amusement. Cipher stiffened, but he didn't turn around. "I'm not avoiding you," Cipher lied, keeping his back to Wesley as he wiped down the counter. "You sure about that?" Wesley's footsteps echoed in the empty room as he stepped closer, the heat from his body radiating through the space. There was no escape now. Without warning, Wesley's hand settled on Cipher's waist, his thumb gently brushing against the fabric of his shirt. Cipher sucked in a sharp breath, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. "I think you are," Wesley murmured, his lips close to Cipher's ear. "And I think I know why." Cipher's heart thundered in his chest, his mind racing. "You think you know everything about me?" Cipher asked, the edge in his voice betraying his nerves. He turned to face Wesley, but before he could say another word, Wesley cupped his chin, tilting his head up. "I don't know everything," Wesley said quietly, his voice softening as his fingers gently brushed over Cipher's skin. "But I want to. I want to know you. All of you." Cipher's breath hitched. Wesley's touch was deliberate, slow, as if he were savoring the moment. It was all so new, so intense. And yet, it felt strangely right. His body swayed slightly toward Wesley, despite every instinct telling him to pull away. Wesley. Cipher's voice faltered, uncertain. The last thing he wanted to do was fall for the man he judged so harshly. But something in the way Wesley looked at him, the vulnerability behind his eyes, stirred something inside him. "I know what you're afraid of," Wesley whispered. "But you don't have to be afraid with me." The words hung between them like a delicate thread. Cipher swallowed hard, his lips parted in silent conflict. The pull toward Wesley was undeniable, magnetic. "I don't trust you," Cipher confessed, his voice shaky, but the words felt freeing. "I don't trust anyone who's had everything handed to them." Wesley's hand slid to the back of Cipher's neck, his fingers digging gently into the soft skin there. His thumb traced the line of Cipher's jaw, his eyes never leaving his. "Then trust me now," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Just for this moment." Before Cipher could answer, Wesley closed the distance between them, his lips brushing over Cipher's in a slow, lingering kiss. This time, there was no hesitation. Cipher melted into him, his body responding instinctively. The kiss deepened, a slow burn that sparked through Cipher's veins, igniting everything he had been trying to keep buried. Their hands explored each other's bodies, tentative at first, then more urgent as the kiss became more desperate. Wesley's grip tightened, pulling Cipher closer until their bodies were pressed together, heat radiating between them. Cipher could feel the undeniable truth of their attraction in every touch, in every breath that left his lips. When they finally broke apart, both of them were panting, faces flushed with heat. Cipher's heart was racing, but there was no regret, only the raw, intense need to get closer, to understand what was happening between them. "I don't know what this is," Cipher admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "but I can't seem to stop myself." Wesley's fingers gently brushed through Cipher's hair, his gaze soft but intense. "You don't have to know," he murmured. "Let me help you figure it out." Chapter 7. The Unspoken Truth. The next few days felt like a blur of emotions and confusion. Cipher couldn't shake the memory of their kiss, the way it had felt, the way it had changed everything between them. He couldn't look at Wesley the same way anymore. There was something there now, a shift in the air, an unspoken understanding that neither of them was willing to address. Work was becoming increasingly difficult to focus on. Every time Wesley came in, Cipher's pulse would spike. The tension was thick, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. But neither of them spoke of the kiss. Instead, they danced around each other, both unsure of what would come next. One evening, after another long shift, Wesley invited Cipher out for a drink. It wasn't a question, it was a command wrapped in the pretense of a suggestion. "I don't drink," Cipher had replied sharply, trying to deflect. Wesley didn't give in. "Then I'll just have to make it more interesting for you," he said with a grin that sent a shiver down Cipher's spine. They found a quiet bar tucked away in the corner of London. The atmosphere was cozy, dimly lit with soft music playing in the background. Wesley ordered for both of them, and Cipher reluctantly took the drink, the cool glass a welcome distraction from the fire brewing between them. "So, tell me," Wesley said, his voice casual but laced with something more. "What's really going on between us?" Cipher stared at his drink, the bubbles rising to the top. He had no idea how to answer that. Every instinct told him to run, to pull away and protect himself from whatever was happening, but he couldn't. Not when Wesley's eyes were locked on him with that same intensity, making him feel like he was the only person in the room. "I don't know," Cipher said finally, his voice low. "But I don't want to push you away anymore. I don't want to be afraid." Wesley's lips curled into a soft, satisfied smile. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing over Cipher's hand in a gentle caress. The touch sent a jolt of warmth through Cipher's body, and he could feel the unmistakable pull between them, stronger than ever before. Chapter 8. A Silent Agreement. Their connection deepened in the weeks that followed. The flirtations grew bolder, the touches more frequent. Their conversations became less about casual small talk and more about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Cipher learned about Wesley's childhood, about the pressure to succeed, the loneliness that came with wealth, and the void he had never been able to fill. And Wesley learned about Cipher's struggles, his sacrifices for his family, his deep-rooted distrust of those with privilege. They were so different, yet in their differences, they found understanding. One night, after a particularly long day at the restaurant, they found themselves alone in the kitchen again. This time, neither of them hesitated. Wesley closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, pulling Cipher into a kiss that was both tender and urgent. Cipher's hands went to Wesley's chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath his fingertips. There was no pulling away this time. Cipher's body responded with an intensity that surprised him. He had never let himself get so close to anyone before, but with Wesley, it felt natural. The kiss deepened, both of them moving in sync, their bodies pressing closer as if they couldn't get enough. When they broke apart, both of them were breathless, eyes locked in a shared understanding. This wasn't just a fling. This was real. And it was terrifying. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," Cipher whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't think anyone does," Wesley replied softly. "But maybe we can figure it out together." Chapter 9. Cracks in the Surface. Their connection grew stronger with each passing day, but so did the doubts. Cipher couldn't shake the feeling that Wesley was hiding something. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, where Cipher saw a flicker of vulnerability behind Wesley's confident facade, something that told him there was more to Wesley than the polished exterior he showed the world. But no matter how hard Cipher tried, Wesley kept his secrets locked away. It was a power struggle between them, one that neither of them was willing to let go of. That night, after a heated argument over their future, Wesley grabbed Cipher by the wrist, pulling him into a kiss that silenced everything. It wasn't gentle or soft. It was raw, desperate, as if they both needed to feel something real. Cipher responded without thinking, his hands threading through Wesley's hair, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and everything that had been building between them came crashing to the surface. In that moment, there were no walls, no judgment, just the raw, intense connection between them. Chapter 10. The Heat of the Moment. The next few days felt like a delicate balance. Wesley and Cipher danced around each other, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words and raw emotions. There was a shift, a silent agreement between them, that neither could ignore. Their interactions were now layered with intensity, far from the casual back and forth they once shared. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the restaurant, Cipher found himself alone in the back office, staring at a stack of paperwork. He tried to focus, tried to push away the pull he felt whenever he thought about Wesley. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Wesley's face, the way he looked at him with a mixture of desire and something deeper, something that made Cipher's chest tighten with unease. He didn't hear Wesley approach until the man's warm breath grazed the back of his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. "You've been avoiding me again," Wesley's voice was low, tinged with something darker this time. There was no amusement, no playful teasing. Only a raw edge, as though he was tired of pretending that everything was fine. Cipher froze, his pulse racing. "I'm not avoiding you," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm not sure what's happening between us." "You've known for a while now," Wesley murmured, his lips brushing over Cipher's ear. "And so have I." Before Cipher could respond, Wesley turned him around gently, his hands finding Cipher's waist, pulling him closer. The proximity felt overwhelming, and yet, Cipher couldn't pull away. Wesley's eyes searched his, filled with something he couldn't quite name. "I need you," Wesley whispered, his voice thick with hunger. "And I know you feel it too." There was no hesitation this time. Cipher's hands moved of their own accord, pushing into Wesley's chest, feeling the heat of his skin beneath the fabric. Their lips crashed together, and this time, it wasn't a soft exploration. It was frantic, desperate, as if the world around them had ceased to exist. Wesley's hands roamed down Cipher's back, pulling him in closer, his fingers brushing against the curve of his hips. Cipher let out a breathless gasp as their bodies pressed together, heat flooding him, the intensity of Wesley's touch making everything else fade away. "I can't stop thinking about you," Cipher murmured between kisses, his hands pulling at the hem of Wesley's shirt, desperate to feel more of him. Wesley groaned in response, his lips trailing down Cipher's neck, nipping at his skin, his hands now sliding under Cipher's shirt, feeling the warmth of his body. "Then don't stop," he breathed, his voice hushed but commanding. "Don't stop now." The kiss deepened, growing more urgent as their bodies aligned in perfect rhythm. Cipher's mind was spinning, caught between the need to maintain control and the overwhelming desire to give in. He had never let anyone this close, never allowed someone to shatter the walls he had spent years building. But with Wesley, it felt inevitable.
Right.
Wesley's hands moved lower, brushing against the waistband of Cipher's jeans, making Cipher's breath hitch. "Are you sure?" Wesley asked, his voice suddenly soft, a question that lingered in the air. "I don't know," Cipher replied, his voice tight. "But I want this. I want you." And with that, Wesley's hands were working to undo the buttons of Cipher's jeans, his movements slow and deliberate. The anticipation, the heat building between them, was almost unbearable. Cipher's heart pounded as Wesley carefully undressed him, his eyes never leaving Cipher's face, as if waiting for any sign of hesitation. But Cipher didn't pull away. He met Wesley's gaze, his breath shallow, his chest rising and falling with the intensity of the moment. Wesley was right. This was what he wanted, even if it scared him. Even if it meant letting go of everything he had been trying to control. When they were both bare, Wesley's lips found Cipher's again, this time softer, more deliberate, as if savoring the moment. His hands explored Cipher's body, tracing the lines of muscle, feeling the heat of his skin. Cipher responded in kind, his hands sliding over Wesley's toned chest, down to his waist, pulling him in even closer. There was no need for words now. The connection between them was electric, undeniable. Wesley's touch was both soothing and urgent, a reminder of everything Cipher had been resisting, and everything he was finally ready to give into. Chapter 11. Breaking Free. The days after that night were a whirlwind. Cipher and Wesley seemed to find a new rhythm, a balance that both terrified and exhilarated him. There were still moments of doubt, moments where Cipher questioned if he was making a mistake, but every time he looked into Wesley's eyes, he saw nothing but sincerity. It was like they were two halves of a whole, drawn together by something neither could control. They spent their days tangled in the uncertainty of what was happening, their nights lost in each other's arms, exploring new depths of intimacy. One evening, after a particularly long shift, they found themselves alone in the apartment Wesley had been renting. Cipher had always been wary of Wesley's wealth, of the polished, perfect life that seemed to surround him. But tonight, everything felt different. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the city lights outside the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. Cipher sat on the couch, the soft fabric of the cushions cool against his skin, and Wesley stood across the room, watching him with a mixture of longing and something else, something deeper, more vulnerable. "I don't know how to do this," Cipher said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I don't know how to be what you want." Wesley took a step closer, his expression softening. "I don't want you to be anything other than yourself," he said, his voice full of quiet assurance. "That's all I've ever wanted." Cipher swallowed hard, his heart racing at the honesty in Wesley's words. "But what if I mess this up?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What if I can't let go of everything I've built?" Wesley knelt in front of him, taking Cipher's hands in his touch warm and steady. "Then we'll build something new," he said. "Together." The word struck something deep inside Cipher, a shift in his mind, a realization that maybe he wasn't so broken after all. Maybe he could let go, just a little. Maybe he could trust Wesley, even if it meant exposing the raw parts of himself he had spent so long hiding. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, his lips finding Wesley's in a kiss that was soft, tender, like a promise. Wesley responded with equal gentleness, his hands cupping Cipher's face, holding him close. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, both of them silently acknowledging the new chapter they were about to start. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, Cipher felt like maybe, just maybe, he could let himself be happy. Chapter 12. The Truth Beneath the Surface. In the weeks that followed, Cipher and Wesley grew even closer. There was no denying the chemistry between them. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental. They had become each other's confidants, each other's strength. Every moment together felt like an exploration, not just of each other's bodies, but of the parts of themselves they had never shared with anyone. But even as they grew closer, Cipher could feel the weight of the past lingering between them. There were still things unsaid, things neither of them was ready to confront. Cipher wasn't sure what Wesley was hiding, but he knew it wasn't just about him. It was about Wesley's past, the things he had kept buried. One night, after a particularly intense argument about their future, Wesley pulled Cipher into an embrace, holding him tightly. Cipher could feel the tension in Wesley's body, the way he was holding back. "I don't want to lose you," Wesley said quietly, his voice strained. "But I'm afraid that's exactly what's going to happen." Cipher looked up at him, his heart aching with the uncertainty in Wesley's eyes. "Then don't push me away," Cipher whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't keep me at arm's length." Wesley's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but he nodded, pressing his forehead to Cipher's. "I'm trying," he said softly. "I'm just not sure how." Cipher leaned in, kissing him gently, their lips meeting in a soft promise. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. "Together." Chapter 13. The Unspoken Desire. The air between Cipher and Wesley had become thick with unspoken desire. Each glance lingered longer, each touch more intentional, but neither of them had dared to vocalize what they both felt. There was an undeniable pull between them, a magnetic force neither of them could ignore. It was late when they were closing the restaurant, the last few customers having long since left, and the night seemed to stretch out before them. Cipher's hands were trembling slightly as he wiped down the bar, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted between them in the past few days. Wesley had been different. More attentive, more present. There was something about the way he looked at him that made Cipher feel exposed in the most thrilling way. "You've been quiet," Wesley's voice broke through Cipher's thoughts. He had come up behind him, close enough that Cipher could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle pressure of Wesley's chest against his back as he leaned over to help him finish the work. "Are you okay?" Cipher swallowed, trying to push the desire threatening to spill over. "Just tired," he muttered, wiping the counter again, his movements slightly more frantic than necessary. Wesley's breath was warm against the side of his neck, and for a moment, Cipher thought he might explode. "You know," Wesley murmured, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just below Cipher's ear. "You can tell me what's really going on, Cipher." Before Cipher could react, Wesley's hands gently cupped his face, tilting his head just enough to kiss him. The touch was soft at first, hesitant. But as the kiss deepened, everything else fell away. Cipher's mind went blank, and his body responded without thinking. He could feel the tension between them crackling, like an electric current. The kiss grew more urgent, Wesley's hands moving from his face to his hips, pulling him in closer. Cipher could feel the heat of his body, the firmness of his chest against him, and for the first time, he allowed himself to fall into it completely. His hands found their way to Wesley's shoulders, tugging him closer as their kiss became more passionate, the line between them blurring in the most intoxicating way. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and flushed, Cipher's voice was barely a whisper. "I shouldn't be doing this." Wesley's fingers traced along Cipher's jawline, his gaze intense yet soft. "Then stop me," he challenged, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that Cipher hadn't seen before. Cipher swallowed hard, his heart racing. He couldn't stop himself now. He didn't want to. With a soft grunt, Cipher took the lead, capturing Wesley's lips once more, this time with more urgency. They stumbled backward, the counter hitting Cipher's thighs, but neither of them stopped. Everything felt too right, too urgent, too necessary. Chapter 14. Beneath the Surface. The next day was a blur. Cipher couldn't concentrate. Every moment of quiet was interrupted by thoughts of Wesley, the feel of his lips on his, the warmth of his hands. He couldn't escape the electricity that had sparked between them the night before. It was too real, too raw. But he couldn't push it away, no matter how hard he tried. The space between them was charged with unspoken promises, and every glance seemed to carry a weight of something more. They worked side by side in silence for hours, the tension growing, the unspoken intimacy between them thickening. Finally, when the restaurant had emptied out, Cipher couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed Wesley's arm, pulling him into the small storage room at the back of the restaurant. The door clicked shut behind them, and Cipher's breath caught as he turned to face him. "I can't stop thinking about last night," Cipher confessed, his voice rough with need. Wesley didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his hand cupping Cipher's face once more. This time, there was no hesitation in the kiss. Their lips met fiercely, bodies pressing together as if they had been waiting for this moment for far too long. Cipher's hands moved to Wesley's shirt, tugging it over his head, his skin coming into contact with the warmth of Wesley's body. He could feel the taut muscles beneath his fingertips, the heat radiating from him. Wesley's hands slid down Cipher's back, pulling him closer, the friction of their bodies sending a rush of desire through Cipher. "I need you," Cipher breathed, the words escaping before he could stop them. It wasn't just physical. It was a need for Wesley, for the connection between them, for the trust that had begun to form between them. Wesley's eyes darkened, his voice low. "You have me." Their lips met again, this time with the intensity of everything they had been holding back. The kiss was desperate, hungry, each movement filled with a mixture of urgency and reverence. Wesley's hands slid down Cipher's sides, pulling him even closer, their bodies grinding against each other in a rhythm that was as natural as breathing. It was as though everything had led to this moment, the chemistry between them undeniable. They shed the last of their clothing, the room growing hotter with each passing second. Their bodies finally came together in a way that felt like destiny, the world outside forgotten in the wake of their desire. Chapter 15. The Consequences. The morning after, Cipher woke tangled in the sheets, Wesley's body warm and still pressed against his. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought about what had just happened. He had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. And yet, as he looked at Wesley's peaceful face, something inside him stirred. Wesley shifted beside him, his eyes fluttering open. He smiled softly, his lips curling up just enough to show the barest hint of mischief. "Morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. Cipher swallowed hard, unsure of how to navigate the aftermath of their passion. "We shouldn't have—" "Don't say it," Wesley interrupted, his hand reaching out to gently trace Cipher's jawline. "We both know it happened because we wanted it." Cipher's breath caught in his throat as Wesley's fingers moved to his lips, gently parting them as if giving him a silent promise. Wesley's face was serious now, no longer playful. "What happens next is up to us," he murmured. "But don't pretend you don't want this too." Cipher closed his eyes, the weight of his feelings pressing in on him. He didn't want to admit it, but Wesley was right. There was no pretending anymore. He wanted this, wanted him. But the fear lingered, the fear of getting too close, of losing control. "I don't know how to do this," Cipher confessed, his voice small, vulnerable. Wesley kissed him softly, the kind of kiss that held comfort and understanding. "Then let me teach you," he whispered. Chapter 16. Uncharted Waters. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, with each moment spent with Wesley intensifying Cipher's feelings. The distance that had once separated them now felt like it had been erased. Their physical connection was undeniable, but it was the emotional bond that began to take root that really shook Cipher. They spent more time together, both inside and outside the restaurant, talking, laughing, and slowly uncovering parts of each other they hadn't been willing to reveal before. The attraction that had begun as a simple spark now felt like a raging fire, one that neither of them was prepared to extinguish. One evening, after a long shift, they found themselves back at Wesley's apartment, the air thick with desire once more. Cipher could feel his heart racing as Wesley's hands roamed his body, igniting every nerve ending in his skin. But this time it wasn't just about the heat between them, it was about the trust they had built, the connection that had evolved beyond the physical. Wesley paused, his eyes searching Cipher's face. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur, vulnerable in a way Cipher hadn't heard before. Cipher nodded, his breath shallow. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I've never been more sure of anything." With that, they came together again, their bodies entwining in a dance that was both passionate and tender, each moment pushing them further into the unknown, but this time with the comfort of knowing they were no longer alone. "I understand you're interested in continuing your story, but I want to clarify that I can help with developing plot, dialogue, and character interactions, focusing on emotional depth, conflict, and tension. If you'd like, Chapter 17, The Unraveling Tension. The evening at the restaurant had left both Cipher and Wesley on edge. As Cipher cleared the last table for the night, Wesley lingered by the entrance, the weight of their conversations from earlier hanging in the air. There was an unspoken tension between them, a deepening emotional pull that neither could fully comprehend or resist. Cipher couldn't help but notice the way Wesley's gaze followed him as he worked, the flicker of something intense in those eyes. It was no longer just the heat of the moment, no longer the playful banter or lingering touches. Something deeper was taking root, something both exhilarating and terrifying. "Wesley," Cipher said, pausing to meet his gaze. "We need to talk." Wesley's lips curled into a knowing smile, one that sent a rush of warmth through Cipher's chest. "About what?" His voice was low, teasing, but there was a vulnerability in it that Cipher hadn't expected. "You don't have to pretend you don't feel it." Cipher sighed, stepping closer. "I don't know what this is, but it's complicated." "You complicate everything." Wesley took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His hand brushed against Cipher's arm, the touch soft, yet purposeful. "I don't think this is complicated. I think you're afraid of it. You're afraid of what this could mean for you, for us." Cipher swallowed hard, resisting the pull to lean into the touch, the warmth of Wesley's proximity. "You're wrong. I just don't think you understand what it's like to have nothing, to fight for every single thing you have." Wesley's expression softened, his eyes searching Cipher's with an intensity that made him weak. "I know more than you think. I get it. And I'm not trying to change that. I'm trying to help you see there's more than this fight. You don't have to be alone in it." Their breaths mingled as the space between them disappeared. The weight of Wesley's words lingered, creating a fragile thread that bound them together, and Cipher found himself unwilling to break it. Chapter 18. Crossing Boundaries. The next day was filled with the usual chaos, but the air between Cipher and Wesley had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding now, an undeniable chemistry that neither could deny. When they locked eyes across the room, there was something electric about it, something that made Cipher's heart race. As they stood behind the bar after hours, washing glasses and cleaning up, the tension was palpable. Wesley reached across the counter, brushing a stray lock of hair from Cipher's face. "You're distracting me," Cipher muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The touch was innocently intimate, but it sent a shock of awareness through him. Wesley smirked, stepping closer. "I thought you liked it when I distracted you." The heat in Cipher's cheeks betrayed him, and his heart pounded in his chest. He knew Wesley was teasing him, but there was a sincerity behind his words that Cipher couldn't ignore. Wesley wasn't just playing around anymore. I don't know what you want from me," Cipher confessed, his voice faltering. Wesley's smile faded, and he took Cipher's hand in his. "I want you, Cipher. I've always wanted you. I just need you to trust me enough to let me in." Chapter 19. Letting Go. That night, after the restaurant closed, Cipher and Wesley found themselves standing together on the balcony overlooking the quiet city. The bustling streets had quieted down, and the world below felt distant, almost as if it were outside the realm of their lives. But here, in this moment, it was just the two of them. Cipher couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this vulnerable, this exposed. Wesley's presence was both comforting and overwhelming. The pull between them had grown so intense that Cipher couldn't ignore it anymore. "You're not what I expected," Cipher admitted softly, staring at the city lights. "I thought you were just another rich guy who didn't understand. But you're different." Wesley stepped closer, his breath warm on the back of Cipher's neck. "I've never been like them. And I don't want you to think that's what I want from you." Cipher's body shivered at the proximity, the closeness, and the tenderness in Wesley's voice. "Then what do you want?" Wesley's lips brushed against Cipher's ear as he whispered, "I want you to let me show you. Let me show you that not everything has to be a fight." Chapter 20. The Breaking Point. By now, the emotional walls Cipher had carefully built around himself were beginning to crack. Wesley had become a constant in his life, challenging everything Cipher thought he knew about love, trust, and vulnerability. One evening, after an especially taxing day, Cipher found himself in Wesley's apartment, sitting on the couch. The soft hum of the city outside was the only sound in the room. Wesley sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. There was a heaviness in the air, a charged silence that hung between them. "You've never let anyone in, have you?" Wesley asked quietly, turning his head to study Cipher's face. Cipher's gaze dropped to his hands, the tremor in his fingers betraying his growing emotions. "I don't know how to. I'm afraid I'll lose myself in it." Wesley placed a hand gently over Cipher's, grounding him. "You won't. I promise." Cipher turned toward him, eyes filled with unspoken fear and longing. "I don't know if I can trust you." Wesley's fingers intertwined with his, the touch tender yet possessive. "You don't have to trust me all at once. But you have to trust yourself enough to feel this. To feel us." Chapter 21. The Leap of Faith. The next few days passed in a blur of stolen moments and quiet exchanges. There was no more pretension, no more hiding. When Cipher and Wesley were together, the world felt smaller, less daunting. The feelings they had were no longer something to run from, they were something to embrace. That evening, as Cipher stood before the mirror, he felt the weight of everything he was about to do. He was about to take the leap, to step into something uncertain and unfamiliar. But with Wesley by his side, he realized he wasn't alone. "You don't have to do this alone," Wesley's voice came from behind him, soft but firm. "I'm right here." Cipher turned to face him, his heart pounding. "Then don't let go." With that, they moved closer, the space between them closing as their lips met in a kiss, slow at first, exploring, gentle. But soon, it became more. More than just a kiss. More than just a moment. It was a promise, one that neither of them could back away from now. Chapter 22. The Breaking Point. Cipher sits on the edge of the bed, his fingers curling around the fabric of the sheets, frustrated by the growing tension between him and Wesley. They had crossed a line. Their once casual encounters were becoming something far more complicated, something neither of them had planned. The lingering touch, the heat in their eyes, it was undeniable. Wesley stands by the window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. "We can't keep doing this," he says, though his voice lacks conviction. "This is messy, Cipher." Cipher's gaze flickers toward him. "Why?" "Because it's inconvenient." Wesley turns to face him, eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. "Because it's dangerous. You know, it's not just about what we want. We can't have both. We can't pretend it's just a fling when everything else is on the line." Cipher stands up, the space between them closing. "I never asked for it to be easy. I just asked for us to be real." Their words are sharp, but their bodies speak a different language, magnetized, pulling toward each other. A slow, inevitable draw. Cipher's hands reach for Wesley, threading fingers through his hair, tugging him close. The kiss is immediate, fierce, and not gentle in the slightest, filled with frustration, longing, and everything they both refuse to acknowledge. Chapter 23. Unspoken Words. The next few days pass in a haze of silence and unresolved tension. Cipher throws himself into his work, the restaurant, trying to ignore the undeniable pull that tugs at him whenever he thinks of Wesley. But Wesley is everywhere. In the way Cipher's hands ache to touch him, the way his body remembers every moment they shared. Wesley's visits are becoming more frequent, each one more loaded than the last. Every time their eyes meet, there's a flicker of understanding, of something more, something neither of them is ready to fully admit. At the end of the day, Wesley catches Cipher alone in the alley behind the restaurant, the sound of distant traffic filling the space between them. Wesley grabs Cipher by the arm, pulling him into the shadows. There's no space for words now, only actions. Cipher's breath hitches as Wesley leans in, their lips meeting in a kiss full of urgency and desire. Wesley's hands move with purpose, exploring the lines of Cipher's body, but there's a gentleness behind his touch, a hesitance that betrays the emotions he's been hiding. Cipher responds, matching the intensity but pushing against the fear of vulnerability. Chapter 24. The Crossroads. It's the night of a gala, and both Cipher and Wesley are caught in the swirl of social expectations. Wesley, ever the polished businessman, is in a tailored suit, surrounded by clients, but his eyes are always searching for Cipher. The moments they steal away, hidden in the quiet corners of the venue, are charged with more meaning than either of them knows how to handle. Cipher is acutely aware of the world they inhabit, one where status and money dictate everything. But in the presence of Wesley, he feels a flicker of something different, something outside of the societal expectations that have bound them both. In a secluded alcove, away from the eyes of the guests, they come together once again. Their chemistry is undeniable, the tension too thick to ignore. Their kiss is slow, building from a gentle exploration to something more desperate, the need for connection palpable in every movement. Cipher presses Wesley against the wall, his hands trailing down Wesley's chest, his body seeking answers through touch. Wesley shudders under the intensity, his hands roaming to Cipher's back, pulling him closer. There's a moment, just a moment, where it feels like nothing else exists but the two of them. The world falls away, and all that remains is the heat between them. Chapter 25. The Decision. As the gala comes to a close, Cipher stands at the window, looking out at the night sky. Wesley joins him, standing in silence. The weight of their choices presses heavily on both of them. They've danced around their feelings long enough. But now, there's a decision to be made, one that could change everything. Wesley's hand comes to rest on Cipher's shoulder, a tentative touch that speaks volumes. I can't keep pretending that what's happening between us doesn't matter. And I don't want to. I don't want to hide. Cipher turns to face him, his heart racing, the last walls around his emotions crumbling. Then stop hiding, he whispers. Let's stop pretending. We've already crossed too many lines to turn back now. The kiss they share is full of promise, the culmination of everything they've been too afraid to admit. There's no hesitation this time, only raw, open need. They break apart only when they're breathless, both of them understanding that what's ahead won't be easy. But they're ready. Their future may be uncertain, but at least, for once, they aren't pretending anymore. The weight of their decisions, of their feelings, is heavy, but it's a weight they're willing to carry together.